Hello everyone, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're returning to Cold Waters, the new game out by Killerfish Games, the developers of Atlantic Fleet and Pacific Fleet, and this game is a hypothetical Third World War game, which puts you in the shoes of a United States Navy submarine captain as a Third World War breaks out. In many ways, it's the spiritual successor to Red Storm Rising, as well as it has some similarities with the SSN game and book by Tom Clancy. Again, Red Storm Rising was based off the book by Tom Clancy as well. We are into part 8 of our Let's Play series of this game. You can see here we've sunk over 160,000 tons of shipping and won both a bronze and a silver star. We are a highly decorated Navy captain, meeting with great success, 5 missions accomplished. We've been at war for 30 days. We've sunk 26 enemy warships, and this video is going to continue that Let's Play. What I will say, though, is despite the fact that we're continuing this Let's Play, if you've been watching this series at all from the start, you'll know these videos are really not focusing too much on the gameplay. The gameplay is there as a background, as something to kind of hold you over. The real content here is the history that I'm trying to talk about. I don't purport to be a professor. I don't purport to be omniscient. So if I say anything here that you disagree with, or you view as wrong, or you know to be wrong, feel free to leave comments in the description. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to share to you, with the best of my knowledge, what I do know about the topic for today's video, and help to inform. So in our last video, we discussed the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program of the United States Navy in the immediate aftermath of World War II. That program was often referred to as GUPPY for short. And what that was a modernization campaign which took place with U.S. submarines at the end of World War II, which allowed these submarines to be made modern enough to progress into the mid-1960s and early 1970s as United States naval vessels actively engaging in operations against any adversary of the United States. More often than not, they were operating in some fashion in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Now, with that being said, the GUPPY was a series of modernizations that were put in place on conventional-powered U.S. submarines, which were built during World War II, were modern at the end of World War II, but were made obsolete because toward the very end of World War II, the German Navy developed a submarine class called the Type 21 class submarine, which had a whole bunch of innovations that made the submarines faster, made the submarines more maneuverable, gave them longer battery life, allowed them to operate below the water longer. All these innovations, which made the submarine a state-of-the-art innovation, and at the end of World War II, the United States, Britain, and Russia all got their hands on this submarine. So the Navy knew their fleet boats were obsolete, despite the fact that the U.S. was coming off of winning a commerce war with the Japanese Empire. They knew they needed to upgrade their submarines, and that's what the GUPPY program was. This video is going to be looking at the first the first attempt by the United States Navy to build its own Type 21, an actual homegrown version of the Type 21. It was a separate program from the GUPPY program, and while the extensive conversions were occurring on these U.S. boats, the United States also began to work on a new standard, SSK, fast attack submarine, but a diesel-powered fast attack submarine. So while the GUPPY conversions were going on, the United States Navy was looking at trying to make a slightly smaller, faster, more maneuverable successor to its fleet boats. The smaller submarines would be, more applicable to the Cold War because they'd be able to deploy forward, base out of Northern Europe, and deploy forward against the Soviet Union. They didn't need to be able to operate across the vast Pacific. They just needed to be able to operate from bases in England or in Germany or in France or Norway. Basically, they'd be right on the doorstep of Russia from the beginning. So the fleet boats were designed during World War II, and they had extremely long range because they were designed to fight against the Japanese on the other side of the Pacific. The U.S. Navy didn't have this restriction anymore. The submarine community within the Navy, they also wanted to employ what was called a closed-cycle propulsion plant to attain speeds they thought could be accomplished as high as 25 knots. They basically wanted to eliminate the conning tower even in the submarine to improve underwater performance, which I can't imagine what a submarine without a conning tower would look like. Maybe something like the Hunley. But essentially, they wanted this closed cycle propulsion system. So what that means is, diesel electric submarines use diesel engines while on the surface or close to the surface via their snorkel, or they used batteries when they were at greater depths. So you had two propulsion systems. Batteries were far quieter and allowed the submarine to operate anywhere, but they had the downside of draining and needing to be recharged. The diesel engine was great on the surface. It allowed you to move quick. It also was respectable, close to the surface, but it was very noisy, and it was very unpleasant when you were using the snorkel because it was just, you're operating a diesel engine underwater in a closed, confined space, and you've got a little pipe that's venting it out. It was not a pleasant experience. And the Germans, as we had mentioned in one of our previous videos, had already done quite a bit of work on the closed cycle propulsion system. So they basically were using hydrogen peroxide as a fuel that could be used in a closed environment where you don't need large influxes of oxygen or anything else like that. And so as a result, the Germans were already working on this closed cycle propulsion system. The problem was, and this system allowed the submarine, theoretically to obtain high speeds underwater without needing to worry about if its battery would shut off. Basically, you could operate more or less in perpetuity below the surface at high speeds. So it was mainly focused on allowing the submarine to approach its targets below the surface. They still kind of thought, well, they'll probably travel to forward areas on the surface. And it's interesting, if you think about this closed cycle propulsion system, this desire to have a submarine that could remain submerged for as long as possible, what you're really hearing is the forerunner to the AIP system, the Air Independent Propulsion System that modern diesel submarines use that allow them to remain submerged for extended period of time. Not quite as long as nuclear boats, but certainly long enough where the difference is probably negligible. You could get into and out of a combat zone in the span of a couple of weeks and then surface when you're well out of danger. But again, this desire for the ability for a submarine to unhinge itself from the need to surface or the need to expose itself is kind of a clear indication of why the Navy would eventually go down the nuclear submarine route. It was pretty clear the Navy was obsessed with being able to develop a system which would allow it to remain submerged as long as the submarine wanted to remain submerged and not be vulnerable by surfacing. The thing was, however, in the early 1950s and late 1940s, the Navy simply wasn't ready. As the Navy for a closed cycle propulsion system, the U.S. attempted to evaluate various different designs, but they never were able to evaluate anything beyond just land tests, basically tests that were going on, on the surface, not in a submarine, not in an operational environment, nothing that was even remotely close to being ready to go into a real submarine. And so the Navy decided, all right, we can't build this air independent system. The nuclear submarine will come, but it's not ready yet. That would be what the Navy would accept as the the closed cycle system. The air independent system would end up becoming the nuclear submarine. But the Navy wasn't ready for that yet, and yet they needed something new. The Guppies weren't going to be sufficient on their own. There needed to be a next generation submarine that could be built. It had to be modern, and it had to be relatively soon. So the Navy began work on what would end up being called the Tang class submarine. This was an effort by the Navy where they said, all right, we're going to develop a submarine roughly the size of the Type 21. It'll have advanced diesel-electric engines as an interim submarine. Basically, this submarine was designed to close the gap until a closed-cycle propulsion plant was proven and available. So the Tang class was the class that would be named after. The first two were ordered in August of 1947, which is when the production would begin. Production began in Portsmouth Naval Yard in Kittery, Maine, for the contract design as well as the construction of the lead ships of the class. Work began on the class in 1947. They'd be built from 1949 until 1952. There would end up being 6 vessels that would end up being constructed. Similar to the Type 21, the Tang would be designed for optimum underwater performance. They would have a rounded bow. They'd have a streamlined fairweather kind of above the ship. There was no conning tower, chocks, cleats, and other topside protrusions. If there were protrusions, they could be retracted. They were giving consideration to removing the actual sail structure, but that was deemed, not to be done. There was no deck gun. It would have 6 torpedo tubes in the front and 2 stern torpedo tubes in the back of the boat. The ship would carry 22 torpedoes. It would use the BQR2 passive sonar, which again was largely copying the German GHG design. And then it had a BQS sonar system, a BQS4, which I believe was the active sonar suite. The Tang was a little bit smaller than previous fleet boats, so it actually required less propulsion. Previous ships had 4 large diesel engines with over 4,000 horsepower. The Tang class would have 4, they call them pancake engines or radial engines. They were 16-cylinder diesel engines. They each generated 850 horsepower. They'd be used on the surface or when using the snorkel to charge the electric batteries. And it would end up having 2 electric motors with a total of 4,600 horsepower for operation below the surface. There were 4 different sets of electric batteries that were put together. They had more than 126 cells for every single battery, so that's over 500 batteries in total. I believe that was similar to the later Guppy boats, actually ended up having similar batteries. The ship had two propeller shafts, and the boat was able to move at 18 knots below the water and 15 knots on the surface, which is actually kind of interesting. This was kind of the first modern submarine design where the submarine would have better performance below the water than it would above the water, and that was a trend you would continue to see, especially once the teardrop hull would be designed for nuclear submarines, as you'd wonder, why would you ever surface a nuclear submarine? Why would you stay submerged so long, some people might ask. But in fact, the reason is because the boats travel quicker below the water because of the way they're designed. And the Tang class was the first class that, again, moved quicker below the water than above the water. The Guppy boats were actually faster. They had about a 20-knot speed on the surface. So the Tang was 5 knots slower below the surface, although they had much better submerged performance of 18 knots. So again, very similar to the Type 21 in that regard. Although I'm not sure if the Type 21 had faster submerged than surface performance. I'm not sure. There was an interesting system that was put in the submarine. It was called an automatic hovering system, which allowed the submarine to quietly, basically just kind of hold its position, hold its depth when the submarine is kind of searching for enemy vessels. If they're kind of sitting and waiting to hear what the enemy's doing, they had this sort of innovative hovering system that would allow the boat just to kind of sit, without making headway. There were some serious issues. Oh, by the way, the 6 torpedo tubes in the front were full size. The 2 torpedo tubes pointed to the rear of the boat were kind of like short torpedo tubes, so I'm not sure if they had to use different torpedoes for the aft torpedoes, but they weren't full-size torpedo tubes, which I don't know enough about. In reading Cold War submarines, the design and construction of U.S. and Soviet submarines, this book that's kind of acting as my Bible throughout all of my learnings here, as well as doing some internet research to kind of back things up and learn some additional details. I can't really find anything on this sort of short torpedo tube, but it did exist, and it was there. The Tang initially had some problems actually with its torpedo ejection system, so the system that would kind of push the torpedoes out from the boat, which required some modifications to be made to the submarine. They had to add actually a total of 24 tons of weight, which then required them to add a little bit of length to the submarine to add some additional stability. So what was originally designed to be a smaller boat ended up being almost a mirror boat in terms of size with relation to the Type 21. The Tang class ended up being 1,575 tons, 1,617 tons, which was virtually identical to the Type 21. Additionally, the submarine had an increased crush depth. So if you remember the Trench class and the Ballo class and kind of the World War II submarines had a 300 or 400 foot safety rating. We knew there were examples of the boats going as deep as 1,000 feet in uncontrolled dives, but they were really only designed for about 400 feet with a safety margin that would push it out to around 700 or 800 feet. The Tang was designed to have a depth of up to 700 feet, and with the safety margin that they use on that, it was given a safety margin that would allow it to dive to a sort of assumed crush depth of 1,100 feet. So again, these boats were basically almost skipjack-like in terms of their diving depth. The Los Angeles class, I think in here, only has like a 900-foot diving depth. The Narwhal, I believe, is 1,000. The Soviet boats go all the way down to like 2,000 if they have the titanium hulls. But in general, this boat had a much greater depth in terms of diving depth. You can start to see some comparisons to some of the Cold War boats in this ship. The first Tang class, the USS Tang, was commissioned in October of 1951. That engine design that we talked about ended up being a horrible failure. It was too lightweight, I guess. They were ideal for short duration trips, but they were apparently very finicky to service. They broke down often, and there were recorded instances of the submarine needing to be towed back to port. Because remember, this is a diesel submarine, so if the diesel engine fails, you can use your electric engine, sure, but only for a limited period of time before those batteries die. And if your diesel engine isn't fixed by then, you've got no way to charge your electric battery, and as a result, you're powerless. So there were a couple of instances where the Tang classes had to be towed back to port. They also had some considerable vibration. The tanks were susceptible to oil leaks. Just a whole bunch of issues. These were not initially very well received boats. The actual last two boats in the class, I mentioned there were six boats. The first four had these unconventional engines. The last two were built with standard inline diesel engines. They weren't very accessible because the engine was designed for the smaller engines, so they too had issues with constant failures, either because there was insufficient space for the engines or because they were the other boats had the issue with the pancake design. Additionally, these ships were very expensive for the time, so they were only able to build 2 a year, and they only built them over a 3-year period of time. So again, they were problematic boats, to say the least. Because these boats had such greater diving depth, because they had the ability to stay submerged for so much longer, you started to see submarines need to take a new approach to anti-submarine warfare. You had destroyers and frigates and anti-submarine aircraft that would make it very difficult to operate on the surface. The submarines could now stay below the surface for long periods of time, and as a result, the Tang class was the first boat in the U.S. Navy that really started to prompt the Navy to realize, all right, our approach to anti-submarine warfare has to change. But that'll be a topic for another video. The Tang class were in commission until 1983. Despite these various issues that the submarines had, they had a complement of 83 men, by the way. Despite the fact that they had all these sorts of issues, they were all in service until at the earliest, the Trigger was transferred to Italy in 1973. The Tang was transferred to Turkey in 1987, and all the boats were either transferred to another country or decommissioned between 1973 and 1987 is when the last one left U.S. control, although again, they were decommissioned by 83. They were kind of held on in the reserve fleet for a little while after that. They went through various overhauls. In 1967, the ships received an extension, which provided a new fire control system. They received a different passive sonar control in the mid-1960s as well. Actually, the upgrades to these boats in the 60s allowed them to carry the Mark 45 nuclear torpedo. So that was a nuclear-tipped torpedo that had a yield of up to 11 kilotons that was used on some of these submarines. We mentioned previously that the Foxtrot class had nuclear-armed torpedoes as well. So in general, this was the U.S.'s first attempt to replicate the Type 21. It had success in the sense that it could dive really deep. It had very fast submerged performance. It could stay below longer. It had a lot of issues with its engines itself. There were compromises made in the engine design to try and make it a quicker, easier maintenance boat, but they all ended up failing, and the boat ended up being a nightmare for maintenance. The smaller engines were designed to save weight. They ended up not working and having to replace them with bigger engines, which then had maintenance problems because they couldn't get to the engines. So all in all, they were interesting boats, trying some interesting concepts, and in some regards they were successful, but again, they had some serious drawbacks. With that being said, guys, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the video about the Tang class. Let me know your thoughts below. As you can see here in the game, we're up to 180,000 tons of shipping sunk. We've accomplished another mission, and we've sunk 5 more enemy ships. So again, we are making progress as we're more than a month through this campaign, and hopefully the war continues to shift into the Allies' hands, or the NATO hands, given that's the side we're fighting on. With that being said, guys, I hope you enjoyed the history of the Tang class. Let me know your thoughts below if this is something you enjoy, you want to continue seeing more of, or if you had any concerns here. I do have a link to the description of the book that I'm using as my reference. It is a great book, and it tells a lot of history. Unfortunately, it doesn't go a ton into the detail for a lot of these ships, so it's not like, you know, I couldn't, if I wanted, just turn around and read the books. There's great information in there, but you really have to look elsewhere if you want detailed histories of specific books. But if you're looking for a top-down look at, the submarine force going into the Cold War thus far, all I can say is incredibly high things about it. It's got a ton of detail in the appendixes as well that I haven't really touched on. It is a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it. Again, the link is in the description. But with that being said, guys, at this point, I'm just kind of rambling, so I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts below, and until next time, as always, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.